Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. It was buried beneath years of dust, forgotten in the corner of my grandmother's attic. The moment I touched it, my fingers tingled as if the leather-bound book had a pulse of its own. The cover was worn, stained with dark blotches that, at first glance, looked like old ink. But when I held it up to the weak light filtering through the attic's small window, I realized with a jolt that it wasn't ink at all. It was blood. I should have left it there. I should have tossed it back into the pile of relics that had collected dust for decades and walked away. But something in me, curiosity maybe, wouldn't let go. That, and the uneasy feeling that the book had been waiting for me. My name is Sam, and I was 24 when I first opened that cursed diary. I had come back to my childhood home to sort through my grandmother's things after her passing. The house, a creaky Victorian relic on the edge of the woods, had always unnerved me as a kid. I hated visiting, but now it was mine. The attic was supposed to be the last thing I tackled before selling the place. I wish I had never opened that trap door. The diary was strange from the start. The pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with handwriting that shifted in tone, sometimes hurried and scrawled, other times meticulous and precise. The dates were erratic too, as if whoever wrote it had no sense of time. The first entry read, August 12th, 1937. There is something in the woods. I've seen it. At first I thought it was an animal, but no creature walks like that. No creature looks at you with such intelligence. It watches me, always. I frowned, flipping through the pages. Most of the entries seemed like the ramblings of someone on the edge of sanity. As I read on, it became clear that the writer, someone named Margaret, was spiraling deeper into fear. The entries grew darker, more frantic. They described sightings of a figure in the woods, a shadow that always lurked just out of view but never left. Margaret seemed to believe that this figure was haunting her, following her every move. September 14th, 1937. I can hear it now, not just see it. The whispers. Oh God, the whispers. I am not safe in this house anymore. Something about the way the words were written sent a chill down my spine. I could almost hear the whispers she mentioned, feel her growing paranoia. And the strange thing was, the more I read, the more familiar the handwriting seemed. It had a sharp, angular quality that tugged at the edge of my memory. I kept reading. October 3rd, 1937. Blood. I woke to find blood on my hands, on the walls. But I don't remember. I don't remember anything. What is happening to me? The entry was stained, as if the blood Margaret wrote about had soaked through the pages. My heart raced. It was too vivid, too real. And that's when I saw it. The last entry, scrawled in a trembling hand. October 7th, 1937. It's here, inside the house. I can feel it breathing, watching, waiting. This will be my last entry. It won't let me leave. It wants me to write. It wants me to... The words cut off abruptly, trailing into a jagged line. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slammed the diary shut, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hand shook as I realized something. The handwriting. It wasn't just familiar. It was mine. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the closed book. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I had seen the diary before as a child. Maybe I was just imagining the similarity. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't written in that diary, but something was making me think I had. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me jump. The attic seemed to pulse above me,   , the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing down on my mind. I could feel it, the weight of the diary pressing That same presence Margaret had described, watching me, waiting for something. The whispers began around midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. The sound was too close, too deliberate, like a voice murmuring just beyond the reach of my hearing. I lay in bed, frozen, straining to listen. The more I focused, the clearer the words became. Come back. My heart pounded so hard it felt like my chest would burst. I didn't want to move, didn't want to acknowledge what was happening. But the voice was insistent, growing louder, more desperate. Come back to me. I couldn't take it anymore. Throwing off the covers, I stumbled out of bed and rushed to the attic door. I had to see for myself. I had to know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The attic was colder than before. My breath came out in frosty puffs as I ascended the creaky steps. And there, in the dim glow of the single light bulb, sat the diary, open, its pages fluttering as though moved by an unseen hand. The room grew impossibly silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I approached the book slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears. There was something different about the diary now. The words, once faded and aged, were fresh, wet. I leaned in, staring at the page. October 7th, 2023. You shouldn't have come back, Sam. My blood ran cold. The date was today. I stumbled back, shaking my head in disbelief. That was impossible. I hadn't written that. I hadn't even touched the diary since earlier. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me. Stay. The attic door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but no one was there. I was alone. Or so I thought. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, taking shape, growing denser, darker. I backed up, my eyes wide with terror, as a figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, its face hidden in shadow. But the eyes... God, the eyes. They gleamed with a sick, knowing hunger. Margaret's figure. It stepped toward me, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs refused to move, frozen by some unseen force. Right, it rasped, its voice the same whisper that had haunted me all night. You must... Right. I shook my head violently, backing into the corner. No, I won't. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly. You already have. Before I could react, I felt something cold against my hand. I looked down and saw the pen, trembling in my grasp, moving on its own. My hand wasn't my own anymore. It scribbled frantically on the blank page of the diary, the ink seeping into the paper like blood. My mind screamed, but I couldn't stop. My hand wrote, and as it did, the words twisted into the shape of my thoughts, my terror. The figure loomed closer, and as I looked up into those terrible eyes, the pen stopped. The final words I wrote stared back at me, clear as day. It won't let me leave. It's been days since that night. I'm trapped here, in this house, just like Margaret. The whispers haven't stopped. The figure watches me from the shadows, waiting, always waiting. I tried to burn the diary, but the flames wouldn't touch it. I tried to run, but the door won't open. Now I understand why Margaret's entries were so erratic, why they became frantic, disjointed. The diary isn't just a book, it's a prison, and now it has me. The desert was a place I had always felt comfortable in. Its vast emptiness, the endless sky, and the ancient beauty of the land had a way of clearing my mind. But there are parts of the desert that locals never talk about, places even the most seasoned hikers avoid. I had heard stories of these places growing up in New Mexico, but I never paid much attention. Legends, I told myself, myths passed down through generations, meant to scare kids and keep people away from sacred lands. But some legends are real, and I learned that the hard way. It started with an innocent enough idea, a solo hiking trip through the remote regions of the Navajo reservation. I had been hiking for years, had explored trails few people knew about. This time, I wanted to go deeper, to venture where most wouldn't dare. A challenge, I thought, nothing more. I told myself I was prepared for anything, but there are some things you can't prepare for. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maps spread out across my dining room table, notes scribbled in the margins, gear checked and double-checked. I had heard whispers about the area I was heading into, a remote canyon system known as the Skinwalker's Trail. The locals avoided it like the plague, and when I asked about it, they would get quiet, offering only warnings. "That's not a place for outsiders," one man told me at the local trading post. Strange things happen out there. But I brushed it off. Superstition, I thought. I'd heard it all before. Stories of skinwalkers, witches, and spirits that roamed the desert at night. But nothing had ever come of it. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. My curiosity had gotten the better of me, and I wanted to see this forbidden place for myself. It was a late summer morning when I set off, the sky clear and the air crisp. The trailhead was easy enough to find, tucked away behind a jagged outcrop of red rock. The first few miles were uneventful, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dry earth and the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation. But as the sun climbed higher, something changed. The air grew still. The breeze that had been pushing through the canyon walls disappeared, leaving the land in an eerie silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was like the desert itself was holding its breath. And then there were the footprints. At first, I didn't notice them. They were small, scattered in the dust, blending in with the animal tracks that dotted the trail. But as I got deeper into the canyon, the prints became more frequent, human by the looks of them. But they were wrong somehow, too big and too narrow. And they appeared to shift, as if whoever, or whatever, made them couldn't decide whether they wanted to walk on 2 feet or 4. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a mountain lion or a coyote, though I'd never seen tracks like this before. I pressed on, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The landscape around me grew more rugged, the canyon walls narrowing and casting long shadows that seemed to move even when I wasn't. By mid-afternoon, I had covered about 10 miles. I was sweating under the heat, but the growing unease was what bothered me the most. I decided to stop for a break, setting down my pack under the shade of a large rock formation. I drank from my water bottle, my eyes scanning the horizon. There was nothing but desert as far as the eye could see, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. In the distance, just at the edge of the canyon wall, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, heat waves distorting the air, making shapes that weren't really there. But as I squinted, I saw it again. A figure, hunched low, creeping along the rocks. It was far away, too far to make out any details, but it didn't move like a person. It moved like an animal. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what to do. Maybe it was another hiker, though I hadn't seen anyone all day. But deep down, I knew better. Something about the way it moved, the way it seemed to vanish into the shadows of the canyon, sent a chill through me. I packed up my things and started walking again, this time at a quicker pace. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the hours passed, that feeling of being watched never went away. The sun began to sink low in the sky, casting the desert in a deep orange glow. I hadn't planned to be out here overnight, but I had misjudged the length of the trail, and now I was too far in to turn back. I decided to make camp at the base of a large cliffside, where I could build a fire and have a clear view of my surroundings. As darkness fell, the desert came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, crickets chirping, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of the wind through the brush. But beneath it all, there was something else. A sound I couldn't quite place. A low, rhythmic chanting, like a voice carried on the wind, too faint to understand but loud enough to hear. I sat by the fire, my eyes scanning the shadows just beyond the flickering light. The chanting grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround me. My heart raced, my body frozen in place. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the sound of the canyon walls shifting in the cool night air. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. And then I saw it again. The figure from earlier, standing just at the edge of the firelight. But now, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't human. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, with long limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, stretched tightly over bones, and its eyes, God, its eyes were the worst part. They were too big, too black, like the eyes of a predator. And they were fixed on me. It opened its mouth, and a sound escaped, a guttural growl, low and menacing, that sent a wave of terror through me. I grabbed the knife from my pack, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something I could fight. For a moment we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. And then it shifted. Its body twisted and contorted, bones snapping and popping as it dropped down onto all fours. Its limbs elongated, fingers turning into claws that dug into the earth. And then it charged. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could through the darkness. The sounds of the desert seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of my heart and the sound of something chasing me. I could hear its footsteps behind me, the scraping of claws against stone, the ragged breathing of something not quite human. I don't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting away. But no matter how fast I went, it was always just behind me, its breath hot on the back of my neck. At some point I must have tripped. I don't remember falling, but I remember hitting the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs. I scrambled to my feet, but the creature was gone. The desert was silent again. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the night sky, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I wanted to believe it was over, that the creature had given up, but I knew better. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, knife in hand, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But nothing came. At dawn, I started walking again. My body ached, my legs barely able to carry me, but I didn't stop. I followed the trail as best I could, though it seemed different now, like the landscape itself had shifted in the night. The rocks were sharper, the shadows darker, and the trail seemed to twist and turn in ways it hadn't before. I was lost. The sun climbed higher, but the heat didn't comfort me. The sky seemed too big, too empty, and the silence was oppressive. I kept walking, though I wasn't sure where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. And then I saw it, something glinting in the distance. A building, maybe. Or a car. Hope surged through me, and I stumbled toward it, my legs barely able to keep me upright. But as I got closer, my heart sank. It wasn't a building, it wasn't a car. It was a pile of bones, bleached white by the sun. Human bones. And standing over them, watching me with those black, soulless eyes, was the creature. It smiled. I was never found. I always believed forests were supposed to be places of peace. I grew up around trees, fields, and hills that stretched far beyond the eye could see. They were the places I went to clear my head, to think, to escape. But after what happened last summer, I've come to realize that some forests are better left untouched, and some things, once found, never let go. It all started when I agreed to go camping with my best friend, Eric. He was the adventurous type, always seeking thrills in forgotten places or unexplored trails. I wasn't as daring, but I trusted him. That was my first mistake. "We'll hit up Willow's Peak," he said. A grin spread wide across his face as we packed our gear. "The place has been abandoned for years. No one goes there anymore." I should have asked why. We set off early one Saturday morning, with nothing but 2 backpacks, a tent, and Eric's trusty old map. It was a warm, sunny day, perfect for hiking. But as we got closer to the trail, I felt something off in the air, a coldness despite the summer heat. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches casting shadows that shouldn't have been there. It was subtle at first, like a whisper in the back of your mind that you can't quite understand, but you know it's there. I brushed it off. After all, it was just a forest. We trekked deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing until it was barely visible beneath the overgrown brush. "Not many people come out here anymore," Eric said, kicking aside a few dead branches. "Guess they're missing out." I nodded, though something about this place felt wrong. The deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. No birds chirped, no rustling in the bushes from squirrels or other small creatures. It was like the forest had been frozen in time, holding its breath. By the time we reached the clearing near Willow's Peak, the sun had already begun to set. The clearing itself was odd. The trees surrounding it were tall and twisted, their bark blackened and gnarled, almost as if they had been scorched by fire long ago. The ground was dry, cracked in places, despite the dampness of the air. "This'll do," Eric said, oblivious to the growing unease in my gut. He started setting up the tent while I gathered some wood for a fire. As I bent down to pick up a stick, I heard something faint, a voice, a soft, almost imperceptible sound carried by the wind. I froze, listening closely, but there was nothing. "You okay?" Eric asked, glancing at me from the corner of his eye. "Yeah," I lied, shaking off the strange feeling. "Just thought I heard something." By the time night fell, we had the fire going and were sitting around it, sharing stories and laughing. But that uneasy feeling didn't leave me. The trees seemed to be watching us, their twisted branches casting long, unnatural shadows that flickered and danced in the firelight. The silence was so intense, it was suffocating. I could hear every crack of the fire, every breath I took, every rustle in the bushes. And then it came again, the voice, louder this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Eric looked at me like I was crazy. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, but the voice was gone, replaced by that suffocating silence once more. "It's nothing," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. Eric shrugged and went back to poking the fire with a stick. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Hours passed, and eventually, we crawled into the tent to sleep. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. That's when I heard it again. The voice. But this time it was clear, unmistakable. A woman's voice. It was faint, like it was coming from deep within the forest. But I could hear it. It was calling for help. "Eric," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "That voice. Someone's out there." He listened for a moment, his brow furrowing, but he shook his head. "It's just the wind, man. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I sat there, straining my ears, trying to make out the words. It sounded like someone crying. "I'm going to check it out," I said, crawling out of the tent before Eric could stop me. The night air was cold, colder than it should have been. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shone it into the woods, but the beam barely penetrated the dense trees. The voice was faint, almost like it was coming from every direction at once, but it was unmistakable now. A woman, crying, pleading for help. "Hello," I called out, stepping closer to the trees. "Is someone out there?" No response. I hesitated, glancing back at the tent. Eric was still inside, probably thinking I was losing my mind, but I couldn't ignore it. I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The further I went, the louder the crying became. It was like it was just out of reach, always ahead of me, pulling me deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around me, their branches tangling above my head, blocking out the moonlight. The beam from my flashlight flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaky. "Where are you?" The crying stopped. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The silence was deafening, more oppressive than before, and then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the voice returned. But this time it wasn't crying. It was laughing, a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. I turned to run, but I couldn't find the trail. The trees all looked the same, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I stumbled through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the laughter grew louder, echoing all around me. And then I saw it. Standing between two trees, shrouded in shadow, was a figure. At first I thought it was a person, a woman maybe. But as I shone my flashlight on it, my blood ran cold. It wasn't human. Its body was long and thin, with arms that stretched unnaturally to the ground. Its skin was pale, almost translucent. And its face, there was no face. Just a smooth, blank surface where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. It tilted its head as if watching me, though it had no eyes to see. And then it took a step forward. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. But no matter how far I went, I could still hear the laughter. Closer now. I burst into the clearing where the tent was, breathless and panicked. "Eric!" I screamed, but there was no response. I ripped open the tent flap, but Eric was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his pack still there, but no sign of him. The laughter stopped, and then I heard it again. The voice. This time, it was right behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just within the shadows of the trees, was the figure. It stood still, its faceless head tilted to one side, as if waiting. I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But as I turned to run, the ground beneath me gave way, and I tumbled into darkness. The last thing I heard before the world went black was that awful, guttural laugh echoing through the trees. I woke up at dawn, lying in the middle of the clearing. The tent was gone. Eric was gone. The forest was quiet once more, but the memory of that night haunts me still. I never went back to Willow's Peak, and I never saw Eric again. I still remember the sound of the carnival. The rickety rides clanked and groaned, the air filled with the shrill screams of kids, and the thick, sugary scent of cotton candy hung in the air. I remember the laughter, the music that was always just a little off-key, and the way the lights flickered unnaturally against the evening sky, casting long, eerie shadows over everything. It wasn't just any carnival, though. It was the carnival. The one that mysteriously appeared every October, just outside town. No one ever saw it arrive, but one morning there it was, fully set up, rides ready to go, tents pitched, and the Ferris wheel towering over the grounds like a silent sentinel. They called it Carnival Nocturne, and it had a reputation. Everyone in town had heard the stories about the people who went in but never came out, the strange noises that echoed through the tents at night, and the things some swore they saw moving behind the rides after dark. But like most kids, I didn't believe any of that. I was 17, and my friends and I were looking for something exciting to do, something that wasn't the same old movies or hanging out at the local diner. That's how we found ourselves at the edge of town, staring at the faded, tattered banner hanging above the entrance to the carnival. There were 5 of us that night. Me, Andy, Jess, Derek, and Lisa. We'd been friends since elementary school, and we were always looking for the next thrill. We joked and pushed each other as we approached the entrance, none of us admitting that we were even the slightest bit nervous. "I bet they've got some real creepy clowns in there," Derek teased, nudging Jess, who had a well-known fear of clowns. She punched him in the arm, laughing. "Shut up, Derek, I'm not scared." But there was a tremor in her voice that made me glance at her twice. The carnival already had an unnerving effect on us, and we hadn't even walked inside yet. At the gate stood a man in a dark suit and a bowler hat. His face was pale, almost sickly, and he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. The way his eyes didn't quite seem to focus on anything made it feel like he wasn't entirely there. "Welcome to Carnival Nocturne," he said in a low, scratchy voice. "The fun lasts all night, but be sure to leave before midnight," Andy snorted. "Why? Does the magic carriage turn back into a pumpkin?" The man's smile didn't waver, but something in his expression darkened. "Just leave before midnight," he repeated. The others laughed it off, but something about his warning stuck with me. Still, I shoved my unease aside. We paid for our tickets and entered the carnival. Inside, the atmosphere was strange. Everything was just a little too quiet. The music that played was old, like it was coming from a worn-out record player, and it slowed and sped up at odd intervals. The lights flickered more than they should have, and every time the wind blew, the entire place seemed to groan and shift like it was alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "All right, what should we hit first?" Andy asked, his voice louder than usual, as though trying to drown out the eerie quiet. Jess pointed toward the massive Ferris wheel looming at the back of the carnival. "I want to go up there." "No way," Lisa said, shaking her head. "That thing looks like it's about to collapse." "It's been here forever, and it's still standing," Derek added with a smirk. "I think we'll be fine." Reluctantly, we made our way to the Ferris wheel. As we got closer, the creaks and groans of the old metal ride grew louder. Up close, it looked even more unstable, the seats swinging precariously as the wheels slowly rotated. But we boarded anyway, figuring it was part of the carnival's old-timey charm. I rode with Jess, while Derek, Andy, and Lisa took the seat behind us. The operator, a hunched-over man with hollow eyes, barely looked at us as he pulled the lever to start the ride. As we ascended, the carnival lights below blurred into a swirling mess of colors. For a moment, I could almost forget how unnerving everything was. But then something strange happened. As our seat neared the top of the wheel, the lights below started to dim. The once vibrant colors faded, and the carnival below seemed to shrink, as though being swallowed by the darkness. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Jess, my voice tight. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is happening?" Suddenly, the wheel jolted to a stop, leaving us suspended high above the carnival grounds. Below us, the once bustling midway was now eerily silent. The people who had been walking around moments before were gone. There wasn't a single soul in sight. "Maybe it's a power outage," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Then I saw it, something moving at the far edge of the carnival grounds. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the dimming light, but as I squinted, I realized it was a figure. A tall, impossibly thin figure draped in tattered rags, standing unnervingly still. "What the hell is that?" Jess whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. "But it's watching us." As the minutes ticked by, the figure didn't move. It just stood there staring up at us with its featureless face. And then, slowly, it began to walk toward the Ferris wheel. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on strings, its long limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. The Ferris wheel jolted again, and we started descending. But the figure was already halfway to us, its pace quickening. I could hear Jess's breathing growing more rapid as we reached the ground. "Get off! Get off!" she shouted, pulling at the safety bar as soon as we were low enough to jump. We scrambled out of the seat, and the others did the same, their faces pale with fear. We didn't need to speak. We all felt it, the oppressive weight of something dark closing in around us. "What the hell was that thing?" Lisa whispered, glancing over her shoulder as we bolted for the exit. But the carnival had changed. The booths we had passed earlier were now empty. The once vibrant lights flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows across the ground. The air had grown colder, and the rides creaked louder, their movements sluggish and unnatural. It was as if the carnival itself had come alive, warping into something nightmarish. "We need to get out of here," Andy said, his voice trembling. We reached the entrance, but the gate was gone. In its place stood a solid wall of metal fencing, stretching endlessly in both directions. The man in the bowler hat was nowhere to be seen. "We're trapped," Derek muttered, his voice barely audible. I looked around frantically, trying to find a way out, but there was none. The carnival stretched on in all directions, twisted and distorted. I glanced at my watch. It was 11:45. "Leave before midnight," I whispered, remembering the man's warning. "What?" Jess asked, her eyes wide with panic. "He told us to leave before midnight," I shouted. "We've got 15 minutes. We have to find a way out." Derek pointed toward the funhouse. "Maybe we can cut through there." Without thinking, we ran. The funhouse loomed ahead, its garish colors and exaggerated clown faces now twisted into grotesque shapes. As we reached the entrance, I hesitated, but the sounds behind us, scraping, dragging, forced me forward. Inside, the funhouse was worse. The mirrors, once simple distortions of reality, now showed horrors that weren't real, or at least I prayed they weren't. Every reflection was wrong. Some showed us as corpses, others twisted our bodies into inhuman shapes. In one mirror, I saw a version of myself without a face, standing alone in the carnival. "I can't take this," Lisa cried, her voice breaking as she stared at her reflection. "We need to get out of here." We raced through the narrow, winding hallways, the sound of something chasing us growing louder. Whatever it was fast, and it was gaining on us. Then we reached the exit door. Relief washed over me as I grabbed the handle, but the moment I pulled it open, my blood ran cold. We weren't outside. We were back at the entrance of the carnival. No, this can't be right," I stammered, looking around in confusion. The same faded banner fluttered above us, the same eerie silence hanging in the air. And then I heard it. The unmistakable chime of a clock, ringing out through the carnival grounds. Midnight. Everything went still. The rides, the flickering lights, the strange figures in the shadows, all of it froze in place. I felt the air grow impossibly cold, my breath fogging in front of me as I turned to look at my friends. But they weren't there. The carnival had taken them, and now I was alone. I don't know how long I've been here. The days blur together and I can't seem to leave. Every time I try, I end up back at the entrance, staring up at that cursed banner. The carnival never lets anyone go. There's something wrong with that house. I've known it my entire life, though I've never stepped foot inside. Perched at the top of the hill just beyond the woods, the house looms over our small town like a forgotten relic from a darker time. People avoid it instinctively, like a wound in the landscape, though no one really talks about it. But now, staring at it under the cold light of the moon, I realize the quiet agreement to leave it alone is about to be broken. And I'm the one breaking it. I never wanted to be here. Growing up, my friends and I would scare ourselves by daring each other to run up to the house's gate. No one ever had the guts to go further. Over the years, it faded from our minds, buried under teenage drama and then adult life. But now, at 32, I was back in town for reasons I would never have imagined. My brother, Mark, had vanished, disappeared without a trace. Last seen heading up to the hill. I had to know why. Mark and I were never particularly close, but family is family. The police had done their half-hearted search, muttering about grown men going missing all the time. but they didn't live here. They didn't know the whispers that still lingered in the air, the stories older folks would tell in hushed voices about the house. The feeling it gave me was more than just unease. It felt personal, like the house was waiting. I hadn't planned to go up there tonight, but when I saw Mark's car abandoned at the bottom of the hill earlier, the decision was made for me. I grabbed a flashlight and a jacket and made my way through the woods, my breath heavy in the cold autumn air. The trail was barely visible now, overgrown with brambles and thorny bushes. The closer I got, the more the house seemed to grow, its shadow stretching across the land as if it were swallowing the earth. The gate groaned when I pushed it open. Beyond it, the house stood silent, its windows black like dead eyes. The front door was ajar, just slightly, as though it had been waiting for someone to return. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't turn back now, not with Mark still missing. I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and an odd sweet scent that made my stomach turn. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and sagging wooden beams. The floor creaked under my boots as though the house was groaning in protest at my intrusion. "Mark?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was suffocating. I moved further in, past an old staircase that spiraled up into shadows, deeper into the belly of the house. My footsteps echoed eerily in the long corridor, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. The rooms I passed seemed untouched for decades, abandoned in a hurry. Dusty furniture, rotting drapes, and forgotten portraits lined the walls, their eyes following me as I moved. The house felt alive, watching me, waiting for something. It was then that I heard it, a faint shuffling noise coming from upstairs. My heart pounded as I froze in place, listening intently. It came again, this time louder, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tightly as I made my way back to the staircase. Each step felt like it took an eternity, the boards groaning under my weight, betraying my presence. The noise upstairs had stopped, replaced by an overwhelming silence that pressed against my ears. I stood at the foot of the staircase, staring into the yawning darkness above. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place behind and never return. But the thought of Mark, whatever might have happened to him, kept me moving forward. One step at a time I ascended, the flashlight flickering faintly. The second floor was colder, the air dense with an unnatural chill. I shined my light down the hallway, revealing closed doors on either side, the wallpaper peeling away in long curling strips. The shuffling sound resumed, closer now, coming from a door at the far end of the hall. My feet moved before I could think, carrying me toward the noise. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out from within. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking as I peered inside. The room was small and dimly lit by a single candle that flickered on a wooden table in the corner. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents scattered across the floor. And there, in the middle of the room, was Mark. He was sitting in a chair, his back to me, motionless. "Mark," my voice cracked, the sound brittle in the heavy air. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, reaching out a hand, but something stopped me. The air seemed to thicken, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I could see his shoulders rise and fall with shallow breaths, but something was wrong. Terribly wrong. "Mark," I whispered, stepping around to face him. What I saw made my stomach drop. It was Mark, but not Mark. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the wall, his skin pale and clammy. His lips were moving, but no sound came out, just the slow, rhythmic movement of his mouth forming silent words. His hands were gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I knelt in front of him, trying to get his attention. "Mark, what the hell is going on?" He didn't blink, didn't acknowledge me. It was like he couldn't see me, couldn't hear me. I grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. "Mark." His eyes finally shifted, locking onto mine, and in that instant, I felt it. The overwhelming presence in the room. Something dark and ancient, like the house itself had become a living entity. Mark's mouth moved faster, still no sound, but now I could see what he was saying, over and over again. "Get out!" My blood turned to ice. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, the beam swinging wildly across the room. And then, I heard it. The slow, deliberate creak of footsteps on the floorboards behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling remained. I wasn't alone. Something was here with us. The air grew colder. The walls seemed to close in, and then the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands trembling, but before I could reach it, I felt it. A cold, heavy breath on the back of my neck. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran, tearing down the hallway, the house groaning and shifting around me. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the doors slamming shut as I passed, trapping me in its labyrinth. I could hear something behind me, something that wasn't Mark. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, closing in fast. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling, my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The house loomed above me, silent and dark once more. I never found Mark. The authorities searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of him. No sign of anything unusual, they said. Just an old, abandoned house. But I know the truth. Something in that house took him. Something that wanted me too. The house on the hill isn't empty. It never was. And now I'm certain it's waiting for me to return. I never believed in ghosts, not until I heard her cry. My name is Eric Davis, and I'm a sound engineer by trade. For the last 10 years, I've been working on documentaries, indie films, and occasionally paranormal shows that focused more on drama than reality. It was a job like any other. Capture the best sound, edit out the noise, and make sure the final cut was pristine. I'm the kind of guy who relies on logic and science, not ghost stories or urban legends. But everything changed when I took that freelance job in New Mexico. It was supposed to be a quick, easy project, an independent film about a haunted town, something low budget and low risk. I'd be in and out in 2 weeks. I didn't expect to come back haunted myself. The town, San Miguel, was small, isolated, and forgotten by most of the world. Nestled in the shadow of the desert mountains, it had been nearly abandoned for decades, save for a few stubborn locals who refused to leave. The history of the place wasn't unusual for a small town. At its peak in the late 1800s, San Miguel was a thriving mining town, bustling with people until the mines dried up and the people drifted away. But there was one story that lingered, one that still sent shivers through the few remaining residents. The story of the crying woman. I didn't care much about local legends. I was there for the paycheck, and I wasn't about to get sucked into ghost stories. My job was simple: capture atmospheric sound, record interviews, and ensure the eerie vibe of the town came through on film. But even on the first night, something felt off. I'd been driving for hours through the desert, my GPS barely functioning as I navigated the rough roads to San Miguel. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert when I finally reached the town. It wasn't much to look at: dilapidated buildings, boarded-up windows, and dust-covered streets. But what struck me most was the silence. Even for a place this remote, it was unsettlingly quiet. I checked into the only inn in town, run by an elderly woman named Maria. She didn't say much as she handed me the key to my room, but her eyes lingered on me longer than I was comfortable with. "You hear her," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "The woman. You'll hear her." Maria continued, her expression unreadable. "When you do, don't follow the sound." I brushed it off, thinking she was just trying to spook the newcomer. The crying woman was just a local tale, something the townsfolk used to keep themselves entertained in a place where not much else happened. But that night, I heard it. I was in my room, headphones on, reviewing the sound clips I'd recorded earlier in the day. The static of wind through the broken windows, the soft creak of old wood settling, and then, faintly, through the noise, I heard it. A soft, mournful cry. A woman's voice, distant but unmistakable. I ripped off my headphones and sat perfectly still, listening. It was coming from outside. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe one of the locals was out late, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the crying continued, growing louder, more desperate. It was the kind of sound that crawled under your skin, a wail filled with so much sorrow, it made my chest tighten. I went to the window, peering out into the night. The moon cast an eerie glow over the town, and everything was still. But the crying persisted, echoing through the empty streets. I grabbed my recorder and headed outside, thinking it would be a good opportunity to capture some authentic, creepy audio. The night air was cold, biting, and the silence was even more oppressive out in the open. The crying grew louder as I walked toward the center of town, but no matter how close it seemed, I couldn't find its source. It was like the sound was everywhere and nowhere at once. I wandered through the streets, shining my flashlight into the shadows between the buildings, expecting to see someone, or something, hiding there. But there was nothing. The crying only grew more intense, more agonized, until it was almost unbearable to listen to. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the entire town was holding its breath. I stood in the middle of the empty street, my skin prickling with unease. I should have gone back to the inn right then. But something compelled me to keep searching. Something in that cry had hooked into me. A deep, unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake. The next day, I tried to ask around about the crying woman, but the locals were tight-lipped. Every time I brought it up, they'd quickly change the subject, their eyes darting away like they were afraid to even acknowledge her existence. One old man, sitting outside the general store, muttered something about La Llorona, a ghostly figure from Mexican folklore, but he wouldn't elaborate. The film crew arrived later that afternoon, and for a few days, the job went as expected. We interviewed a few of the older residents, gathered stories about the town's mining history, and tried to capture the desolate atmosphere of San Miguel. But every night, without fail, I heard the crying. It always started the same way, soft, almost imperceptible at first, before growing louder, more sorrowful. No one else seemed to notice it, and I didn't dare mention it to the crew. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but it was driving me insane. Every night I found myself out on the streets, chasing the sound, trying to find where it was coming from. And every night, I found nothing. A week into the project, the crying escalated. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like it was following me, surrounding me. One night, after hours of searching, I found myself near the old church on the edge of town. The building had been abandoned for decades, its roof caved in and its windows shattered. The crying was deafening now, coming from inside the church. I stood at the entrance, hesitating. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something was pulling me forward, compelling me to step inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the crying stopped. The silence inside the church was oppressive, as if the walls were holding in years of unspoken sorrow. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper into the nave, the floor creaking under my weight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of rot hung heavy in the air. Then I saw her. At the far end of the church, near the altar, a figure stood with her back to me. A woman dressed in tattered white, her long dark hair hanging limply over her shoulders. She was motionless, silent, but I knew This was the source of the crying. I should have run. Every part of me knew I should have turned and fled. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat as I watched her. "Hello?" My voice echoed unnaturally in the empty church. She didn't respond, she didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Are you okay?" Still nothing. She remained perfectly still, her back to me, her head slightly bowed. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears, drowning out the oppressive silence. Something about her was horribly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I took another step, and that's when I saw it. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating, just inches above the floor, her toes barely brushing the surface. My stomach twisted in horror, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But before I could turn, she moved. Her head snapped around to face me, her eyes wide and hollow, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and her eyes, oh God, her eyes were nothing but black, empty voids. I stumbled back, tripping over a broken pew, my flashlight flickering wildly as I scrambled to my feet. The woman's scream filled the air, but it wasn't a sound. It was inside my head, a piercing, bone-chilling wail that rattled my skull and made my vision blur. I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get out. The church walls seemed to close in on me as I bolted for the door, my chest heaving, my legs burning. The scream followed me, echoing in my mind, growing louder, more desperate with every step. I burst out into the cold night air, collapsing onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. The scream cut off abruptly, leaving me in silence once more. My entire body was shaking, my mind reeling from what I'd just seen. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't tell the crew. I couldn't. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But the next night, when I heard the crying again, I knew the truth. She wasn't a legend. She wasn't a story. The crying woman was real, and she was never going to let me go. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, demons, cursed lands, none of it ever made sense to me. It was all stories for campfires, meant to scare people into behaving, or maybe to give remote places an air of mystery. So when I got invited to a trip with a group of friends to an old abandoned village in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, I didn't think twice about going. But now, I can't escape the feeling that something followed me back. My name is Lucas Baird, and I've spent most of my life hiking, camping, and seeking out remote places with untouched beauty. This trip was supposed to be like that, another adventure off the beaten path. We were headed to a place known as Black Hollow, a village that had been abandoned for over a century, sitting in the shadow of thick woods. The legend surrounding it was that the land was cursed. I didn't care. I was more interested in the idea of photographing a forgotten piece of history, not buying into the rumors that made most people avoid it. The idea was simple. 4 of us, me, my buddy Sam, his girlfriend Megan, and her friend Tasha, would hike in, spend 2 nights exploring the remains of the village, then hike back out. Nothing too crazy, just a weekend away from city noise. Sam was always down for these kinds of trips, and Megan liked the thrill of ghost towns. Tasha was more reserved, but Sam insisted she'd warm up once we got out there. The hike started off like any other. We parked the car at the base of the mountain and followed an old, overgrown trail into the woods. The trees were dense, towering above us, and the air felt different, thicker somehow. It wasn't long before the path became hard to follow, disappearing beneath layers of fallen leaves and creeping vines. But Sam had a map, and between his compass and GPS, we were confident we'd find the village without issue. As the hours passed, the atmosphere began to change. It wasn't just the growing darkness that creeped in as the sun dipped behind the mountains. It was something deeper, a sense that we were walking into a place untouched by time, a place that wanted to remain hidden. Megan, always the brave one, joked about it, saying the cursed land was just giving us a hard time. But Tasha was quiet. Her eyes darted around like she was sensing something none of us could. By the time we reached Black Hollow, the air was eerily still. There was no sound of wildlife, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of birds. Just silence. The village itself was little more than a few crumbling stone foundations, some weathered wooden beams sticking up from the earth like ancient bones. It felt lifeless, but at the same time, heavy, like the ground itself was holding its breath. "We made it," Sam said, setting down his pack. "Home sweet home." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. But something felt wrong. I tried to rationalize it, maybe the altitude, or the fact that we'd been hiking for hours with little rest. But it didn't explain the way the air pressed down on my chest. We set up camp near what looked like the remains of an old church. It was the largest structure left standing, its walls partially collapsed, but the stone frame still intact. Megan, ever the thrill-seeker, suggested we explore inside after dinner. Tasha didn't seem thrilled about the idea, but Sam was all for it. I figured, why not? It was just an old building. That night after we ate, the four of us grabbed our flashlights and headed into the church. The inside was damp, cold, and smelled faintly of rot. The floor was uneven, and the remains of what might have once been pews lay scattered around, rotting into the earth. But what struck me most was the markings on the walls. Strange symbols carved into the stone. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they gave off an undeniable sense of malevolence. Megan traced her fingers over them, her brow furrowed. "Anyone know what these are?" she asked, her voice echoing in the empty space. "No idea," Sam said, snapping a picture on his phone. "Probably something left by whoever lived here." Tasha spoke up for the first time in hours. "We shouldn't be here." We all turned to look at her. She stood near the entrance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I don't like this place." "Come on, Tosh," Megan said. "It's just an old village. Nothing's gonna happen." But Tasha wouldn't move from her spot. There was something in her eyes that unsettled me. Fear, real fear. But not of the building or the village itself. It was like she could feel something none of us could. I was about to suggest we head back to camp when the air shifted. A cold draft swept through the church, carrying with it a low, distant sound. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, weeping softly. We all froze. "Did you guys hear that?" Sam whispered, his bravado slipping. We listened, our breaths held, and there it was again. A soft, sorrowful sob echoing through the empty space around us. It wasn't coming from the church, though. It was outside. Without thinking, I moved toward the door, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The others followed, the silence between us heavy with tension. We stepped outside, scanning the village. But there was no one. Nothing but the empty ruins and the black expanse of woods beyond. But the crying continued, louder now, as if it were moving, circling around us. "That's enough," Tasha said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." Before any of us could respond, there was a sharp crack, a sound like splintering wood, and Megan screamed. I whipped around, my flashlight catching sight of her as she stumbled back from one of the stone pillars near the church entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked, rushing to her side. She pointed at the ground, her hand shaking. There was someone there, right there." I looked down. There was nothing but dirt and broken stone. "I swear I saw someone standing there," she insisted, her voice trembling. "They were watching us." Sam stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This place is messing with us. We need to calm down." But I knew he didn't believe his own words. None of us did. That night we barely slept. The crying never stopped. It moved through the village, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it felt like whoever, or whatever, was weeping was standing right outside our tents. I lay awake, staring up at the dark fabric of my tent, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something to happen. By morning, none of us mentioned the sounds. We packed up quickly, eager to get away from Black Hollow. But as we began the hike back, the woods didn't feel any safer. The trees seemed to close in on us, the path winding in ways that didn't make sense, leading us deeper instead of out. The crying followed us. By the time we realized we were lost, the sun was already sinking low in the sky. The forest was darker here, thicker, and the air was heavy with the same oppressive weight that had clung to the village. It was as if we had wandered into a place that didn't want us to leave. "We have to go back," Sam said, looking at his GPS, which showed nothing but static. "Retrace our steps." But the thought of returning to Black Hollow sent a cold wave of fear through me. I didn't want to go back. None of us did. But the further we walked, the more twisted the trail became. Soon, it wasn't even a trail anymore, just dense underbrush, the trees growing so close together that we had to push through them. Then, without warning, the crying stopped. We all stood there in the middle of the forest, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, listening to the sudden, suffocating silence. It was as if the world had been muted, the sounds of the forest swallowed up by something far more sinister. And that's when we saw them, figures standing among the trees, just at the edge of our vision. Tall, shadowy shapes, barely visible in the fading light. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched us, their forms blending with the darkness. Megan was the first to bolt. She ran without warning, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she disappeared into the woods. Sam shouted after her, but his voice was lost in the thick air. Panic surged through me, and before I knew it, we were all running from the village, from the crying, from whatever cursed land we had stumbled into. I don't know how long we ran, but by the time we stopped, gasping for air, Megan was gone. We searched for hours, calling her name, but the woods were silent. Too silent. When we finally found our way back to the car, there was no relief. Only a hollow emptiness, knowing that we had left something behind. Something that wasn't just Megan. We never spoke about what happened in Black Hollow. We never went back. But even now, years later, I hear the crying. It follows me, everywhere. And I know, deep down, that I'll never escape it.